what do you think about the ceasefire in Gaza? Netanyahu seemed to be turning, okay, stop in Gaza, turn to the West Bank. But, you know, what do you, what's your perspective there?
Well, my perspective is that all of the crimes, and they are war crimes, that Israel has committed since, well, actually before October 7th, but let's just start with October 7th, 2023, when Israel killed many of its own people. This is something that has not been given enough attention. The Hamas attack, these are lightly armed people. We're supposed to believe that all those cars, the images we've seen of the cars burned up in the huge hundreds of cars, that these people with light arms are the ones who did this. Israel killed their own people. Now, some people say it was the Hannibal Directive and they have a policy of killing people in case they're captured, or it could be friendly fire. I can't speak to their motivation, but I want people to know we keep hearing about the 1,300 people. Most of them were killed by their own country. That's the first thing. And then immediately, Israel goes on this killing spree in Gaza, which it could not have done without Joe Biden. Joe Biden ran over there and kissed Netanyahu's ring. He even lied. Immediately, we heard about Israel bombing a hospital, and Biden said, well, we know it wasn't you. We know it was the other people. Now, that was just a blatant lie. So we've had hospitals bombed, universities bombed, every home bombed. Then they bombed people who've lost their homes in who living in tents and refugee camps. And the estimate of deaths is about 200,000. People keep repeating this 45,000 number, but that's from the first few months. This went on for more than a year. It's about 200,000 people, and none of it could have happened without the U.S. We had a weak president who, lives in the past, Biden, who was not well, which is one of the reasons Kamala Harris lost. For 4 years, they told us he just has a stutter. When people noticed a decline, we're not crazy. We noticed he had these very weird outbursts and rages and confusion about where he was and couldn't even read from a teleprompter. And just your common sense, we've seen it. Everyone has seen people in decline in their later years, and that was Joe Biden. So we had a weak president, all that to say. We had people like Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, who were maniacal, is the word, in their support of Israel. We have a weak international system, the ICJ, the World Court, International Court of Justice, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The ICC had to be dragged kicking and screaming to finally issue an arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. The ICJ, it's more than a year now since South Africa charged Israel with committing war crimes and genocide. And before I go any further, genocide is defined. There's a convention. I believe it's not from 1948. The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and it spells out very clearly what acts are genocide. Basically, it's targeting a group of people with harm. It could be physical harm. It could be mental harm. It doesn't even have to be killing. It's very, very clear that Israel's actions constituted genocide. And that it's a war crime to bomb a hospital. Now, Israel always said Hamas was everywhere. Well, Hamas was in the nursery school we bombed. Hamas was in the hospital.
Mosques,
What's that?
800 mosques that they've destroyed.
Yes, yes. Nothing left standing.
Yeah.
I remember seeing footage of Israelis saying they had a tunnel. It was always about Hamas tunnels. They had a tunnel in a hospital. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, that's just a hallway. What tunnel? It's a hallway in a hospital. Of course they have hallways. It was, but the U.S. gave Israel impunity,
Right.
protected Israel at the United Nations, at all these international bodies. But the blood of all those people is on the hands of the United States, and not just Biden. As far as I'm concerned, Biden, they should issue an arrest warrant for him from the ICC. But it was the Biden administration, it was Congress, and it was bipartisan support for Israel. So finally, and this, the ceasefire they finally agreed to, as imperfect as it was, had been on the table for more than a year. And it's Trump. I hate to give Trump credit for anything, but he's the one who came in and he had one of his people tell Netanyahu, you're going to agree to this after more than a year. And
Right.
so he did. Now, Israel, of course, now they're occupying the West Bank, which is illegally occupied anyway, doing the same thing, killing civilians. They even tear up olive trees, tear up crops to make certain that Palestinians can't try to keep them from surviving at all. Children being shot, people used as human shields, all sorts of horrific acts. But
American citizens being shot.
oh yes, but if it's Israel that shoots you, well, too bad.
Yeah.
And so Israel goes from, one crime to the next. And, the people I know and respect say we should be glad that this ceasefire agreement came to be. The suffering of the people of Gaza is a lot less, still not perfect, and we don't know what Trump is going to do. He said a couple of days ago that Jordan and Egypt could take in the people of Gaza. Jordan and Egypt have been asked before, and they've said no. They're still saying no. It does not benefit them to take in more than 1 million people each, who will radicalize their populations. These are both U.S. client states, by the way, but they don't want hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians in their countries. So, so we see the Trump of old saying, I'll be more pro. And he's already invited Netanyahu to visit. He's the first, what a
Yeah.
surprise, first foreign
Yes,
leader
President.
for him to invite to this country. So
Interesting. Yeah.
but as long as the U.S. props up Israel, I'm afraid that Palestinian people are going to suffer, and the U.S. is an accessory to these crimes.
Well, with all that, let's turn to Ukraine. What do you think is going to happen there? What's your perspective there?
I don't know, because it was Republicans who said they wanted to end funding for Ukraine. And by the way, it's not just weapons the U.S. pays for in Ukraine. The U.S. is supporting the entire Ukrainian state. Everything a government does in Ukraine, they could not do without U.S. money. So when we say Ukraine, let's be clear about what we mean. But Republicans had said they wanted the funding to stop. But it was last spring in 2024 who stepped in and got the deal done and got the Republican House Speaker to go along with the funding again. It was Trump. So, some Republicans resisted briefly, but they all gave in. So Trump says I can end this war in a day, just a couple of phone calls. It's all nonsense. Of course he can't. But you don't know what he wants. But Ukraine is, it's a tragedy that's been going on for 30 years, since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the collective West got all of the former Soviet satellite states. All the Eastern European countries are now EU members, NATO members.
Right.
And they tried to pull Ukraine in as well. And this was a red line for the Russians, who've been putting up for this little by little for the past 30 years. Um, Putin, when they called it a special military operation, sending troops into Ukraine. They were baited into it. They were in a tough spot. Ukraine was shelling the Donbass, the region of Ukraine that did not go along with this government. The U.S. had an actual coup. The U.S. was part of it in 2014. There were agreements that were never adhered to, the Minsk Accords that were supposed to give autonomy to certain regions, Donbass region, freedom of language, so people, Russian speakers wouldn't lose their language rights. President Zelensky grew up speaking Russian, by the way. He didn't speak Ukrainian until he was an adult. How about that? Um, but of course, the Biden was hoping to, as someone telling tales out of school, I think it was Austin, the defense secretary, who said, we want to weaken Russia. Well, they thought they were going to sanction Russia and have regime change or weaken the country. None of that happened. In fact, when they sanctioned Russian oil prices went up everywhere. And so Biden was responsible for that part of the inflation. And then they had this stupid, what was it, Putin's price hike? Well, prices have gone up. It's all because of Putin. And even they realized how ridiculous that was. They dropped it fairly quickly. But the U.S., I can say it, more people should. The U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline that took an inexpensive natural gas from Russia to European countries. But Biden's team blew it up. And now Germany is deindustrializing. European countries they really, really undermine themselves being good little vassals of the U.S. And now Trump's beating up on them anyway. So that's the only funny part of it. But like Denmark, so he's demanding that Denmark turn over Greenland. Denmark did everything. The explosion of Nord Stream was in Danish waters. I think international waters, but closest to Denmark. And Denmark was supposed to investigate. And at the end of the day, they just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, it was sabotaged and blew up because they didn't. Everybody knows the U.S. did it. So part of me is not sympathetic to Denmark and other European countries. But where does Trump really stand? It's hard to say. He's unpredictable. Also, presidents don't get to do just what they want to do. Not just the deep state, but the ruling class, the military-industrial complex. They've gotten fat off the Ukraine war. Do they want that to end? So it should end. There should be an agreement, a security agreement that states fully, that goes back to the Minsk Accords that later European leaders admitted was a sham. Angela Merkel and others said, well, we just did it to give Ukraine time to rearm. We didn't really intend to stand by it. So that's what should happen. What Trump will do, I really don't know. It's so difficult to say.